Hello, welcome back into my studio. I've been busy playing with watercolour and I have put together a little video to show you some of the things that I've learned about how to use my brush, how to use my water and my paints, different types of strokes that you can use, pressure differences, just how I play with my watercolour and how I work with it. Now, no one's taught me about watercolour. I've just learnt a lot through experimenting and play. I've learned a lot about what not to do and a lot of things that I think work really well for me. So as you work through the tutorial and you play with your colour and your paint and the water, you'll find that maybe some of the things I've shown you, you're not that keen on. And you might discover some new things that I haven't thought about. Anyway, go and have fun and, well, come with me now. I'll show you what I've done. Okay, today I'm going to show you a few of the watercolour techniques and brush strokes that I use. So I am just using these Micador paints, and these are just like student paints or kids paints, but you'll get the idea of what to do. So you need some watercolour paint, water and paper towel for blotting, and I really like a round brush. It's good because you can get a really fine point on your brush, and then but it's big enough that it can hold water. And the whole idea of watercolour for me is allowing some looseness and unpredictability in the work. So when I'm holding my brush, if you think about holding a pencil and you hold it close to the tip, you have a great deal of control over what you're doing. And the really lovely thing about watercolour is it's a process of letting go. So I like to hold my brush higher up on the stem, and then you have a more fluid movement and you just let go a little bit more. So I'm going to show you a couple of different things that I do. So first of all, you always want quite a bit of water in your watercolour. You can always dab it off in your paper if you're worried that you've got too much pigmentation on there. And you can start off, oh, I don't know what colour to start off with. Let's do this colour. So you can see it's nice and fluid, and I'm using the side of my brush and I'm rolling my brush as I go. See how I'm holding it really, really loosely? Then what you can do is you can add, so that's wet, and you see if I add another colour to it, and I just touch it. Oh, it doesn't want to bleed there. It's not enough water. See how it's bleeding? If you've got a good amount of water, it'll move around. So you have wet on wet. And then when that dries, you end up with really interesting effects. Another thing you can do, so that was using the side of my brush. If I want to do a bit more fine work, I just use the point of my brush. So see how fine I can get it? Really, really fine. So you know how you can buy watercolour brushes that are really small? I'm not a big fan of them because they don't hold very much water, so you end up getting a drier effect from your watercolour paint, and you lose a bit of the element of, it's not surprise, but you know, it's not as predictable if you have more water and a bigger brush. So that's another thing you can do. So you can also, so that was a pretty smooth motion. So if I load up my brush with some paint, see how I keep dipping it into the water and I get more paint? If I hold it upright like this and I just go like that, you can get a nice edge. And see how the pigment is distributed in a different way to if I was rolling it. So you get like a dark spot and you get lighter areas as well. And then if I go over and I put another brush on there, see how they blend on the edges? They can bleed into each other, and you can see it a bit more if I use a different colour. See how that's moving now? So they can mix on the paper. It's a good way to play with colour mixing. Sometimes you make brown, sometimes you want to make brown. But see how it picks up that colour? And you might not have thought that you wanted to do that combination, but just by moving your brush around and playing, you can do that. Another thing, I'm a big fan of dots. So I like to add little dots. And you can see how they kind of pull on the surface and remain contained if you just press really lightly. And then if you're going into the wet, you can see how that has a really interesting effect on the wet. And that's dried enough that it's not going to spread through the other watercolour paint, but see how that's wet, so it's spreading. So you can always do really interesting things with the dots. And I just always try and keep my hand pretty loose, up high on the brush. And another thing is fun to do is to flick your paintbrush. So you can get a bit of texture that way and a bit of unpredictability. See how it's gone into there? So it's not contrived at all. There's just like a really interesting randomness to it, which I really, really like. So you can get big, see how the pigment, because the pigment sits in the end of the brush here, so you've got a darker colour and it moves into light. So you can see by doing different actions with your brush, you'll get different behaviours of the colour will behave differently on the paper. So I showed you how wet on wet works. You can have wet on dry. So you might like to try having a light colour underneath and then putting a darker colour on top. We have a dark colour underneath and you let it dry and you put a light colour on top. So if you think about the things that I've talked about, you've got really wet loaded up, the splatter, using the tip, using the side, just like a side roll of your brush. You can, once you put it down, you can pull it and encourage it to move like that. You can, you know how I said I'm not keen on a small brush? Well, if you do have a smaller brush and it's a little bit drier, you can make it dry by dabbing it out on there. But if you dry it a bit, so you can get a bit of texture like that, so like the lines coming through. See if I can do it in a darker colour so you can see. So you can get a nice texture, and that's just another nice contrast. And contrast is always a good thing in art because it pulls your eye around. And if you're looking for contrast, you're looking to experiment and change and looking for difference, which I think is also a good thing. What else can I show you? I think that might be it. Like I mentioned in my other video, playing is really, really, really important. So having an attitude of asking, what would happen if I did this? What would happen if I did that? I'm just approaching it as an experiment. So you don't need to have a particular outcome in mind. It's always nice when things work out, but you learn an awful lot when they don't. So don't be afraid to experiment. Hold your brush loosely. Put some music on. and just have a play. See what happens, see what you learn, and have fun.